And here we go. Once we get that up to full screen, we can then start talking about globalization. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so globalization and its political impacts. And really what I'm going to be looking at is just globalization in general. Because remember, as we're discussing the postmodern era, one of the major themes is this growth of internationalism. This realization that countries around the world cannot live in isolation anymore. One way to not live in isolation was to follow the path of the Soviet Union and become communists, like China did, like Cuba did, like North Korea and North Vietnam did, and like other countries in Latin America and Africa did as well. That was one path. The other path is led by the United States, and this is to be the growth of free market capitalism. This idea of free trade, where people are free to do business with anybody around the world. The ability to have access to resources and markets so people can buy and sell goods relatively easily. The idea is if there is economic cooperation, and particularly in response to allowing openness to trade, then everybody's economy will do better. The global economy will be even better. Does that make sense? Good. So we're going to look at globalization. Just to define globalization, globalization is just an acceleration of the circulation of goods, capital or money, and people within the world economy after World War II. Now, globalization is something that has been happening since the early modern era. Ever since the Europeans explored and discovered the Americas, we see the entire world connected in some way via trade. That continues to get heightened because of European imperialism. And now after World War II, we are going to see an explosion. You are still living in an era of ever-increasing globalization. We are more connected to each other across the world than we have ever been. And another thing I want you to note and to understand and to remember, that when I talk about this idea of globalization, this whole thing is within the context of the Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States are competing with each other for whose ideology is the best. So while a lot of this is going to sound like, oh, that's so nice of them. They want to help. They want to provide aid for other people's economies. That's so kind. A lot of the times, all they're trying to do is make other nations choose capitalism over communism. Does that make sense? So remember, this is aided by the Cold War, and in a lot of ways, you see European countries, and particularly the United States, and well, I know they're not European, but Western countries like the United States and the Soviet Union actively trying to seek out others and try to make the world more globalized. And so when we look at globalization, and particularly globalization in regards to the way that the United States leads the charge, we have to look at this idea of what I call alphabet soup for the globalized soul. Because after World War II, the United States and Western countries create all of these acronyms. And all of these acronyms stand for organizations, international organizations, that have one main goal. And that one main goal is to promote free market capitalism. And one of the ways that we see the United States and other Western powers trying to encourage capitalism right after World War II is the Bretton Woods Conference. And the Bretton Woods Conference is when economic and political leaders from the United States and other Western European nations met in New Hampshire, in a place called Bretton Woods. They meet at Bretton Woods and they discuss how can we help people rebuild after World War II. And what they create is the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund is kind of like the United Nations for the global economy. Those nations that are a part of the International Monetary Fund contribute a certain amount of money, and the idea is the IMF will provide loans for any economies that are failing after they have become a part of it. So it's a little bit of a safety net. It's an insurance net for countries to be a part of. But it's a way that we see global, international cooperation in helping each other build their economies. Does that make sense? Good. You then have this push for what is called free trade. And you then have the GATT, which I believe is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. That's going to also be in around 1947, and it's when Western European nations are going to agree to try to promote this idea of free trade. This idea that it should not be difficult to do business with other countries if it's possible. And this is really a response to what happened after World War I. World War I, we saw the United States providing a lot of loans for Western European countries and for other countries around the world. But once the United States went into the Great Depression, and then that spread into a global depression, most economies, and especially in Western Europe and in Japan and other places, most economies, to protect themselves, put up incredible tariffs. They tried to stop foreign trade because they wanted to protect their economy at home. Do you remember what a tariff is? A tax on imported goods. And what a tariff does is it allows your economy, it essentially forces you to hashtag buy local. By making foreign goods more expensive, they want to encourage the local economy. Exactly. Yeah, good. Hashtag support your local. Nicely done. But so the general agreement on trade and tariffs and trade was organized in order to try to promote countries to stop using tariffs, to drop tariffs, to make trade easier. So even if Peter and Bryce are trying to compete for who can sell the most soccer balls across the world, just because Peter is in the United States and Bryce is in Europe, it doesn't mean that they should be competing with each other with tariffs. They should be able to compete, and people should be able to buy whoever soccer balls they want without any sort of tax on them. Does that make sense? And that's the general agreement. Now this evolves, and I believe it was in 1993, this evolves into the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization is one that helps to try to promote free trade. And countries that are involved, I believe there's around 113 countries that are involved, essentially create free trade agreements. Agreements that they will trade a certain way. They'll help to regulate prices. They'll help to make sure that that business and practices are being done fairly. And if any country goes against the WTO, the World Trade Organization has the power to impose sanctions, or essentially to impose tariffs, which will dramatically hurt any economy that goes against them. Does that make sense? So both the IMF and the WTO, and to a large extent the United Nations, are there as to show you international organizations that were created after World War II that promote economic cooperation. That make sense? So if the UN represents political cooperation, the IMF and the WTO are economic cooperation. Yeah, they're very similar to that. The IMF is also a part of the World Bank, and the World Bank works very closely with the United Nations in order to help provide loans for struggling economies around the world. And the idea is, by developing those economies that are struggling, you then now have a new trading partner. You know what I mean?
Like, it basically benefits everyone.
Exactly. Well, that's the idea of it. Cool?
Does it work out?
We'll talk about that. Okay? In addition to international agreements, you also have regional trade agreements, and that's what you see here with all these wonderful alphabet soups as well. I'd start with the European Union. Usually that is something that students understand the most. In around the 1950s, I want to say it was 1953, there was a treaty organized by all Western European nations. And the agreement is that if we can provide a regional trade organization, something that instead of focusing on national economies, we focus on the European economy as a whole, we might be able to build up faster. And what the European Economic Community, and then eventually the EU does, is they create their own European economy. And they do so by creating a single currency. So whether or not you are in France, in Spain, or in Germany, you will use the euro. Does that make sense? In addition, they drop borders. So borders become invisible when it comes to economics. That means trade. So trading between Spain and France, there's no barriers. There's no tariffs. You can do it easily. In addition, that also applies to workers. So if you live in Spain, but you want to work in France, all you got to do is figure out how to drive your car over the mountains and get there. Exactly. And that's part of helping travel. So the idea is goods, people, and money should be able to flow freely within any countries that are part of the EU. Does that make sense? which is why it's really scary for some people that Britain is leaving, because Britain also has control over the Rock of Gibraltar, which is on the southernmost tip of Spain. And so there are people that live in Spain but work in Gibraltar. But if Britain leaves the EU, they then have to have a passport to get to and from work. So it's pretty interesting. So that's actually one of those weird things as Britain does that. Britain? Yeah, Britain's already left the EU. Largely because we're going to talk about this, and Axel asked the question. The whole idea is globalization, like I said, is going to sound really wonderful, but for some people, it is going to dramatically impact their life. And so what we are seeing now, currently, is actually a reaction against globalization. The election of Donald Trump, the election, or the Brexit, the Britain leaving the European Union, even almost the last election that just happened in France, the elections that are happening in the Netherlands, all are starting to see these political parties that are anti-globalization gaining power. Does that make sense, or did I just lose you? Which one?
No.
Okay. Good. So that's the European Union. And I'll talk about the other two first. Two more examples of regional trade networks are Asian. The Association for Southeast Asian Nations. Asian. Right? So Asian started out as a small trade agreement between, you guessed it, countries of Southeast Asia, and then eventually they add Japan in there as well. But it's a regional trade agreement that does similar things to the European Union. While they don't have the same currency, they at least reduce trade barriers. They agree to have more open and free trade within themselves. Make sense? In 1993, I think it was 1993, either 1993 or 1997, the United States felt left out because they didn't have a regional trade agreement. And so they got together with other North American countries and created the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. So you see these regional free trade agreements. They don't always have to be geographically located. And one example of that is OPEC, or the Oil Petroleum Exporting Countries. Oil Petroleum Exporting Countries. And OPEC is actually mostly countries in the Middle East, but also includes Venezuela and some countries in Africa. It's countries that all share the same resource and are in charge of exporting the majority of the world's resource, which is oil. And so what they do is they work together to set oil prices so that not one country is benefiting more than the other, so that demand stays high. And it's why when I started driving when I was your age, gas was over $5 a gallon. And that's not even that bad, because in the 1970s, this is what gas looked like. Those are not people parked on the side of the road. Those are people waiting to get into a gas station. Don't look at the price, it'll just depress you. But if you look at this thing called gas lines, because OPEC was actively upset at a lot of the things that the United States was doing, and so they cut off a lot of the supply of the world's oil, which made an incredible low supply, and so it was in high demand. You had to only get gas on certain days, and then when you went to get gas, you had to be prepared to wait for sometimes hours. Huh? Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? So these regional trade organizations can have major impacts on places around the world, but it's a way to safeguard themselves and also make sure that the oil, the petroleum, essentially that gas is a valuable resource. And like I said, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but globalization and these free trade agreements, for some, is an incredible opportunity. I mean, the ability to be able to go from your own hometown in one country and move to another easily without any other restrictions and go where there is work has provided a lot of opportunities for people, especially within Europe. But at the same time, it's also caused a crazy gap. And we're going to look at one of the reasons why that gap ensues a little bit later. So one of the first things that we see causing globalization are these free trade agreements that happen both internationally and regionally. Make sense? We also cannot discount the role that the United States plays in this. And one of the interesting things to think about and to really make comparisons, and Gabe, I think you'll like this comparison. Some people like to, choked on myself.
Full of the fly.
Yeah, I don't know what just happened. Some people consider the United States in the postmodern era as an extension of those European imperialist empires. They look at the United States and they see a lot of similarities between the British during the modern era that were going around and grabbing territories. And while the United States is not politically conquering other territories, they are certainly putting their tentacles out. So here's how they're doing that. Number one is the U.S. economic success. After World War II, and because largely of World War II, the United States economy was booming. Add this to all these free trade agreements, and the United States being the economic superpower that it was able to gain access to markets and resources in places all around the world. And one of the ways we see the United States extending its influence is through the growth of transnational corporations. Those are TNCs, transnational corporations. A lot of the clothing that you are probably wearing right now, less than I thought. Oh, good, Peter. A lot of the clothing that you are wearing right now, oh, good, Angel, is a product of transnational corporations. One of the most popular is actually Nike, and that's what I was looking for, is your socks and your shoes. Nike, based in the United States. Those shoes are not made here. Those shoes are, take off your shoes right now. Where are they made? Where are your shoes made? Take them, go. I don't think it's China. It might be Vietnam. Where do you get Vans? Yeah. Where did you get Vans? Where are they made? Bangladesh, where are yours? Indonesia. No, probably. Oh wait, hold on. Made in India, and I can't put this on now because it's not a slip-on. So, made in India. Don't smell. So made in. Look! Those are American companies. And those are American companies that have factories and other things in other countries. That's what makes them transnational. Does that make sense? And these companies become so big, and they are consistently looking for ways to get cheaper resources and ways to get cheaper labor so that they can reduce the price. So why can Mr. Oftedal afford this? Why can Mr. Oftedal afford those shoes that I promised you at one time were nice? Right? Why can I do that?
You did Smith thing.
I don't know what that means.
Oh, the teacher who got into like all that stuff at like Goodwill.
No, I bought this in Macy's. But I bought the shoes at Off Broadway or something like that. One of those. It's like the Ross for shoes. But anyway, so yeah, but it's like even lower than Payless, I'm pretty sure. Which I love. Listen, don't get me wrong. I love Payless, and I love Off Broadway because I can afford those shoes. So the whole idea is TNCs are consistently looking for cheaper resources to make their product and cheaper labor. If a minimum wage in the United States is going to be $10 an hour, are they moving up to 15? Yeah, they're going to make it to $15 an hour, and they have to pay a factory worker, somebody making these, $15. Why wouldn't they go to Bangladesh where they could pay them $2 an hour? Because the average, are you ready for this? The average yearly income around the world is $2,000 a year. And you could not live in the United States on $2,000 a year. The average family income, $10,000 a year. You could not live anywhere in the United States for $10,000 a year. So the point is, TNCs are going to be going everywhere, which is why Hershey's chocolate, one of my favorite TNCs, ruined my childhood because they moved their chocolate production from Pennsylvania, and I used to go there. Hershey chocolate. And literally, it's Hershey, Pennsylvania. That's where it is. Yeah. So they moved their factory from Hershey, Pennsylvania, where I grew up going to because they have a little theme park, like Knott's Berry Farm, and they moved it to Mexico. Which isn't bad. I'm not upset at Mexico. I'm just saying the idea is you see these transnational corporations. Make sense? And that's one way that the United States has been. Yes, that's exactly it. In addition, the United States is also seen as extending its influence because of its military successes. And something that I actually have never used before, but it worked really well. I used it in the second period today. The Navy's recruiting slogan is a global force for good. Because the United States military has bases all around the world. And that was largely because of alliances they made to combat the spread of communism. And so the reason that the Navy can be a global force for good is because the United States military presence is everywhere. And because of these Cold War victories, people see the United States as, again, like the British, extending their influence. Lastly, and something we're going to carry over to the next, is the United States' cultural influence. Because whether or not we realize it, the United States is the trendsetter of the world in some things. One of a prime example of that, and Gabe, I'm going to need your help on this. The prime example of that is the influence of Hollywood on other places. For example, we know Bollywood as the example from Mongol Pandi. Bollywood, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Bollywood is essentially India's version of Hollywood. A lot of similarities, especially in the sex sells sorts of things. I think somebody described Mongol Pandi as all boobs and blood or something like that. And I was like, oh, I got really scared. But then I watched it and I was like, oh, wait, that's not true. So anyway, there are a lot of similarities between Hollywood and Bollywood, but there's also differences. What are your dad mentioned some other places. Iran is one of them, but what was the African country? Do you remember? There was one African country that your dad said is having a film industry boom right now. You don't remember? Okay. So anyway, Iran is having a film industry boom right now as well. And you see these mini kind of Hollywoods popping up all around the world, and that's U.S. cultural influence. Why? Wait, and I know this is kind of an old reference now, so you can laugh at me later. But why is it that we watch Gangnam Style, we go, that's hysterical?
Funny.
Well, no one understands what he's saying, but why?
He's Korean.
Yeah, he's trying to be American.
Exactly! We look at Psy and we laugh because we're like, dude, you're not American! You're Gangnam? What is this? Wait, what is this? Right? Like, we laugh at it because it shows the cultural influence of the United States. Because Gangnam is a section of Seoul, South Korea that is known for its wealth and its opulence. It's known for people driving fancy cars. It's known for people wearing flashy clothes. So it's equivalent to our type of Hollywood or our LA or our Fifth Avenue. Say it again. Yeah, it's like our Bel Air. And so, yeah, it's like exactly like our Beverly Hills, our Bel Air, like the Prince of Bel Air. So, when you look at Gangnam Style, that is evidence of the cultural influence of the United States elsewhere. In addition, U.S. culture and this idea of free trade has also promoted a global culture, and that global culture is best defined as consumerism. This idea that you continuously buy, and you can have stuff and things will make you happy. And that's largely an influence of the United States. And it's best seen and described, especially I love this because historian Jerry H. Bentley, same hemispheric integration guy, he's the one that uses Barbie, and that's why I love it. So he talks about how Barbie is a perfect symbol for this consumer culture. So if we zoom into Barbie, and hopefully the same thing doesn't happen that happened for good. So when we zoom into Barbie, careful. When we zoom into Barbie, we look at how she's a perfect American woman, yeah?
Sure.
Easy. So we look at Barbie and we see everything that we want in an American ideology, this feminist ideology, this ideology that a woman can do whatever she wants. She wants long hair, she can have long hair. She wants giant gold earrings with massive squares, despite the fact that she barely has any earlobes. She can have it. She wants to wear this dress or any other dress, or a bathing suit that shows her belly button, or she wants to break up with Ken, date Ken, marry Ken, reject Ken, whatever she can do whatever she wants. She's consistently smiling and happy. She's always got makeup. And shoot, we all know Barbie can also go naked if she wants.
Ooh, except if she was a real person, she dies.
Yeah, the proportions, which is great. Don't ever Google, don't. So, the point is, Barbie has all of these choices. And Barbie can choose whatever she wants, and that's consumerism. You can buy packs that have different accessories for her, which is so weird for me. But anyway, the whole idea is Barbie represents this consumer culture. And this consumer culture spreads around the world, particularly in industrialized societies and then post-industrialized societies who are becoming fairly wealthy. And as more people can afford more things, more people are having goods that mimic this idea of Barbie. But westernization can sometimes go against traditional values. And so sometimes you're going to see societies actually rejecting Western values. And if you remember back to chapter 23, that was the two examples between Ataturk in Turkey and the Shah of Iran, not the Shah of Iran, but the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, who had two different perspectives on whether westernization was a good thing. Ataturk and his love for dancing and his playbook, no. Ataturk and his love for all things Western, all things secular, this idea of dressing like a European, he creates a very modern, secular Turkey that allows for Islam to be practiced at the home, very similar to what the United States and what the West was doing. In Iran, particularly after 1979, you see Islamic fundamentalists. Islamic fundamentalists rejecting westernization and saying, no, 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 no. We are going to be Islamic because that is our heritage and that is what is right. A fundamentalist, and I'm going to have you write this word down because it is important. A fundamentalist refers to a person or a group of people who go back to the basics of their religion. And the basics of their religion is going to be outlined by what?
Moral.
Yeah, your text. Go back to the text. And fundamentalists, actually the word fundamentalism actually started as a Christian movement in the United States. It was a Christian movement that largely rejected the hippie movement and the other things that were the secular culture that was filling the television sets during the 60s and the 70s, both in the news and out of the news. And this was a way of saying, no, 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 we've lost our American roots, we've lost our morality, we need to go back to Christianity. And that's where you see televangelism, that's where you see these mega churches growing up, this is where you see Billy Graham and his Campus Crusades. So that's fundamentalism. But fundamentalism is also seen in the world of Islam. In places like Iran, and Afghanistan, and other places around the world, pronounce it correctly, don't say Afghanistan, right? So around the world are going to practice more fundamentalist Islam. These are going to turn into your extremist terrorist group. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, they all look at the world and they look at Western consumer culture as a virus that is slowly killing the morality of the world. And so they see it, and they see themselves as the defenders of the world who are trying to protect against that. Make sense? But I want you to know, if you get a question tomorrow on fundamentalism, it's probably referring to fundamentalist Islam and the development of terrorist groups post-World War II. And largely because of the spread of the U.S. culture and communist culture being forced upon the global South. Yes, that's exactly why the United States, and especially right now, ISIS isn't attacking the U.S. as much as it's attacking Europe. I mean, how many attacks have been in Paris in the past year? 3?
Wow.
Right? So, in London as well. I mean, so it's because Western culture is seen as that, and fundamentalism says, no, we won't stand for it. Yes?
Do the economists, do they think that, for, the global South, it's going to bounce back in years to come? Or, is the West is going to
Well, let's talk about that. Well, we'll talk about that in a little bit, and I think that is a very complicated question.
Yeah, that's like, I don't know.
So, but let me talk about that. And again, I got to move it quickly. So, ladies and gentlemen, here's the fundamentalist response to Barbie. Meet the Sarah doll of Iran. The Sarah doll of Iran is clothed in traditional Iranian attire, which covers up all things that would be traditional in Muslim society. Her best friend is not her boyfriend, it's Dara, her Muslim cleric. And so you see that her best friend is a Muslim man who's going to help her achieve Muslim salvation, right? The idea. Again, she's a little bit more traditional in that. A different example, and from actually a fairly unlikely and sometimes surprising source, is the version of Barbie in Japan. And that's the Leica doll. And the Leica doll looks at Barbie, and Japanese traditionalists looked at Barbie and said, okay, whoa, this does not click with our society. There are some things we like. Consumer culture, the idea of buying, a capitalist economy. But there's some things we don't like. We don't necessarily like this idea that women are free because they can choose whatever they want and speak out whenever they want. So what do? They have the mouth closed. The accessories that she can have all refer to childbirth. And you can get the accessory of a stroller or some other sort of baby thing because they wanted to promote that among their young. There you go. They wanted to promote the idea of being a mother and saying that is actually liberating. That is a wonderful thing for a woman to do. She doesn't have to be going out and choosing between Ken or whatever boy and whatever group that she wants to choose from. There you go. I don't think Barbie. Did they ever make a pregnant Barbie? No.
Yeah,
They did?
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
What? Oh my gosh.
So, when we look at global consumer culture, we have to understand that it's not just a one-way street, though. It's not always just the West going outward. It's also the other way. And you look at some of the things of my childhood. Cartoons. Many of the cartoons I love and I grew up with and some of you oddly know about are Japanese. Pokemon.
Yes.
Sailor Moon is more of an obvious example, but things like the Ninja Turtles, Transformers.
How would we not know about this stuff?
They're Japanese. And so that is an example of other culture going the other way. Ladies and gentlemen, this suit, I don't even know. Oh, it's Tommy Hilfiger, so it is actually American, which makes sense because I was told by a student here that I literally have to buy American because my build doesn't actually fit the European. Yeah, no, it wasn't Anna. No. Anna wasn't my suit seller. Right?
I thought you said student.
No, I said a suit seller. So, ladies and gentlemen, Giorgio Armani, people love to say, oh man, that's Gucci. Right? Gucci is an Italian company known for its fancy clothing. That is the influence of Italians on elsewhere. Swiss watches are known. So we see consumer culture actually being something that is, yes, sometimes a one-way street, sometimes a very Western thing, but sometimes it's also the global South on the receiving end. One of the most popular examples of globalization and globalized culture and consumer culture is Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is one of the most popular artists of all time around the world. And if we have time, the fun video that I'll have you watch is a prison in Southeast Asia that allowed their prisoners to do, during their rec time, allowed them to learn the Thriller dance. And they do a really good job. So they put our air bands, which never happened, did it? Never happened. But if air bands had happened, it could have been this good. So, and I'm going to go very quickly here. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the last things that I wanted to look at as a cause for globalization is improved communication technology. Now, we know that by the end of the modern era, there were telephones, there were telegraphs, there were ways to communicate in a lot of ways instantaneously around the world. In your time and in our time, the internet has become an incredible tool to increase communication throughout the entire world. And in a lot of ways, it's become this age of access. We can access things instantly. My buddy isn't living in China anymore or studying. He was actually studying in Mongolia for a bit, and that was cool because I could say I have a friend in Mongolia. But I had a friend who was working in China. I could call him. I could Skype with him. I could email. I would email him. When the Chinese government released an Air Force video talking about how awesome their Air Force was, but then people discovered it was just cutscenes from Top Gun. It was cutscenes from Top Gun. That was awesome. I emailed my friend about it and said, what the heck is going on over there? And the Chinese government probably put me on lockdown. But anyway, the idea is I could do that. That's incredible. So the internet has created a lot of different opportunities for people. But it has also heightened inequality. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. About inequality actually gets heightened because of globalization. Another interesting thing is that English becomes the language of the 21st century. People around the world speak English. And what do you call somebody who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call somebody who speaks 3 languages? What do you call somebody who speaks 1 language? American. So, that's good. So, ladies and gentlemen, I learned that when I was in Norway because they made anyway. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to look at now is globalization. Like I said, it is something that is seen in a lot of ways, and especially in our culture, as a really positive thing. And don't get me wrong, it has been for a lot of people, and particularly our society. But there's also times where it has not been. And so there are very much so positives and negatives to globalization and this increased economic interconnectedness. To start with, there are some incredible examples of places and countries, particularly in the global south, that have really grown economically and exponentially. Probably the best example is Japan. After World War II, obviously, Japan was economically devastated. And all it could do is focus on its manufacturing. So that's exactly what it did. The government heavily invested, after they were eventually granted independence from the United States, heavily invested in manufacturing and the creation of all these factories. And now, what does everybody drive? Good. Good, Vivi. What kind of cars? What? Honda. Toyota. Right? Porsche is not Japanese, however. So the idea is you see Japanese cars, and particularly because of the auto industry, Japan becomes one of the largest economies in the world during the postmodern era. Back. The 4 Asian tigers are also East Asian countries. Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea become some of the fastest growing economies ever in history. However, there is also a very big disparity between the North and the South. And let me say this before you go, because it's an important thing to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1945, there are countries that were already industrialized and there were countries that were not industrialized. Those countries that industrialized already were able to continue to grow, while the countries that were not industrialized could not catch up. So a lot of the countries that were becoming industrialized after World War II have started, which is why your shoes are being made in Southeast Asia. And that has helped the Southeast Asian economy because the United States continues to buy things. However, the African economy never actually is able to industrialize. And so for that reason, you see global inequality because of globalization increasing exponentially. So the haves have even more, but the have-nots are still struggling. Thank you very much. Good luck tomorrow. I look forward to seeing all of you.
Hello.